The air in Eisenhower's headquarters was electric, buzzing with tension that had been building for months, yet this morning it felt sharper, almost tangible. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, but it did little to warm the room, as though even the light sensed the storm brewing within the walls. On the polished wooden table lay maps of Europe, dotted with pins and colored markers indicating the latest Allied movements. Each mark represented lives that hung precariously between victory and annihilation. Eisenhower stood at the head of the table, his tall frame rigid, his face lined not just with age, but with the weight of responsibility. He had spent years navigating delicate alliances, coordinating armies, and now he faced a problem no battlefield could solve. Two of his greatest generals, Patton and Montgomery, were on the verge of tearing the Allied effort apart. Patton was the first to enter the room, his boots clicking against the floor with military precision, but his demeanor suggested he was anything but calm. His uniform was immaculate, perfectly pressed, medals gleaming, yet his eyes burned with barely contained fury. He did not bother with formalities. "Montgomery is delaying everything," he barked, pacing back and forth like a caged lion. "We cannot wait for him to overanalyze every move while the Germans regroup and fortify their positions. Every hour we hesitate, men die. Every hour we lose ground." Eisenhower listened patiently, though the lines on his face deepened. He had learned to tolerate Patton's temper because he understood the man's genius. Patton's audacity had saved countless soldiers' lives through sheer speed and decisiveness. But there was a danger in that audacity, a danger that came from his disdain for rules, protocols, and, most importantly, anyone who didn't match his pace. And Montgomery, by contrast, was the embodiment of methodical caution. He moved deliberately, planned meticulously, and had an unshakable faith in procedure. Where Patton acted, Montgomery calculated. Where Patton charged, Montgomery waited. As Patton's voice rose, Eisenhower allowed himself a brief glance at the map. There, on the lines of advancement, the stark contrast between the two men's approaches was visible. Patton's divisions were like lightning, darting forward with ferocity, leaving trails of liberation behind them. Montgomery's positions were solid, almost immovable, fortifying gains, minimizing losses, and waiting for reinforcements to consolidate territory. The map told a story of brilliance but also of friction. One wrong move, and that friction could ignite into a catastrophe. Patton stopped pacing abruptly and slammed a gloved hand onto the table, rattling pins and papers. "He's a bureaucrat, Ike, a man obsessed with protocol while the war moves around him. I've seen men like him before, afraid to take risks, afraid to lose face, afraid to do what needs to be done. Meanwhile, the enemy does not wait. He does not calculate. He strikes." His voice echoed in the room, reverberating off the walls lined with trophies, flags, and mementos of past victories. Eisenhower raised a hand, his tone calm but firm. "George," he said, using Patton's first name, "I know your frustrations, and I know your style wins battles. But you must remember, we are commanding a coalition, not just an army. Your actions are not isolated. Every move you make affects not just your troops, but every Allied division. Montgomery's caution, annoying as it may be, is part of a larger plan, one that involves forces far beyond your immediate reach." Patton's jaw tightened. He respected Eisenhower, but only in his own way, and that respect had limits. And yet, Ike, every delay, every hesitation, costs lives. I cannot sit by while the Germans regroup, because Montgomery wants to review every detail of a report. We are at war, not a planning convention. His eyes, ice blue and burning with intensity, fixed on Eisenhower's. "You understand this, don't you?" Eisenhower did understand. He understood all too well. He had seen Patton's tanks break through enemy lines with devastating effect, watched him execute maneuvers that no one else dared attempt, and witnessed his uncanny ability to read the battlefield like an open book. Yet, he had also seen the cost, the reckless exposure, the unnecessary risks, the anger that could fracture alliances. And he had seen Montgomery, the spit and polish general, as Patton sometimes called him, who could make a mountain out of a molehill in reports and charts, but whose careful calculations often saved thousands of lives. It was a clash not just of strategy, but of personality. Patton thrived on chaos, Montgomery on order. Patton sought glory in bold moves, Montgomery sought victory in certainty. Eisenhower, ever the mediator, knew that history would remember the results, not the egos. But for now, he had to balance both. The room was silent for a moment, broken only by the rustle of papers and the faint ticking of a clock on the far wall. Then Patton, in a rare moment of almost self-reflection, muttered under his breath, "If we ever clash with him directly, the Allies will implode, and the world will never forgive us." Eisenhower did not respond immediately. He turned his gaze back to the map, tracing the lines of supply and movement with his finger. The war was in a delicate phase. The Allies had landed in Normandy months ago, but the German forces were still strong, entrenched, and capable of turning any misstep into a massacre. Every division mattered, every decision carried weight, and every personality had the power to tip the balance between success and disaster. Patton moved closer, his voice dropping, almost conspiratorial. "Do you know what frustrates me most, Ike? Montgomery thinks this is a game of chess. Every move calculated, every pawn measured. He doesn't see the battlefield, he doesn't see the momentum, he doesn't understand speed." Eisenhower allowed a faint smile, not of amusement but of recognition. He knew Patton's obsession with momentum, the almost manic need to strike while the iron was hot. But he also knew that Montgomery's caution had preserved entire divisions, prevented disasters that Patton's impatience might have caused. They were two sides of the same coin, and his job was to keep them spinning in harmony rather than letting them shatter into chaos. Patton, sensing Eisenhower's hesitation, leaned closer and lowered his voice. "I don't want to respect him, Ike. I don't want to rely on him. But I have to, because if I don't, the war is lost." There was a moment of silence as the weight of his words settled in the room. The reality was undeniable. They could not afford for their rivalry to affect the outcome. The enemy was merciless, and the Allies could not afford internal collapse. Eisenhower finally spoke, his tone measured, deliberate. "George, your instincts are invaluable. Your speed, your aggression, your audacity, they are what win battles. But remember this, war is not just about winning battles, it is about winning the war. And to win the war, we need every piece on the board, Montgomery included, whether you like it or not." Patton's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with grudging acceptance. He was not a man who easily compromised, yet he understood the stakes. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, and stepped back from the table, his energy momentarily checked. Eisenhower knew this truce was temporary, fragile, and likely to shatter at the first provocation. But it was enough for now. For the rest of the morning, the headquarters buzzed with activity. Officers moved between rooms, carrying reports, maps, and messages from the front lines. Radios crackled with intelligence updates, each bringing new information, new challenges, new sparks of tension. Patton, restless, could not sit still. He walked among the staff, checking reports, questioning officers, sometimes contradicting the very orders he had helped write the night before. His brilliance was matched only by his unpredictability, and those who served under him learned to expect both genius and fury in equal measure. Montgomery, in contrast, remained miles away in his own headquarters. ERs, meticulously reviewing reports, plotting routes, calculating artillery ranges, and considering every possible outcome. To him, speed was meaningless without certainty. Lives were not expendable, and victory without planning was meaningless. He despised improvisation, which, in his view, was the enemy of strategy. The contrast between the two men could not have been starker. Patton was fire incarnate, explosive, relentless, unrestrained. Montgomery was ice, calculated, unyielding, precise. Eisenhower, standing between these two extremes, felt the weight of their rivalry as if it were a physical presence pressing down on him. It was not just a clash of personalities, it was a clash of philosophies, of approaches to war, of visions for victory. By late afternoon, Eisenhower convened a small meeting with his closest aides. They discussed troop movements, logistics, and strategies, but always with one eye on the looming conflict between Patton and Montgomery. Every recommendation had to be filtered through the lens of their personalities. Every order had to account for potential friction, for hidden agendas, for the pride and stubbornness of two of the most brilliant generals the world had ever seen. Patton, meanwhile, continued his rounds, his frustration barely contained. "We are on the brink of something monumental, and yet we are held back by hesitation," he exclaimed to a young officer. "Do you understand? Hesitation is death. Hesitation is surrender." The officer nodded, unsure whether to admire Patton's fervor or fear it. Both were dangerous in their own way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the maps and plans that littered Eisenhower's war room, the general took a deep breath. Tomorrow would bring another day of difficult decisions, of egos clashing, of lives depending on the delicate balance between audacity and caution. Patton would strike, Montgomery would calculate, and Eisenhower would hold the fragile line, guiding two brilliant but incompatible men toward a common goal. And so, in the dim light of that war room, with tension hanging heavier than any fog in Normandy, a fragile alliance was maintained, not through friendship, not through mutual respect, but through necessity. The battlefield outside awaited, and the world had yet to witness the extraordinary, dangerous dance between two of the greatest generals of the era. A rivalry that could either save the Allies or destroy them entirely. The days that followed Patton's furious confrontation with Eisenhower were a delicate dance of strategy, ego, and barely concealed contempt. Across Europe the war raged on, a relentless tide of fire, smoke, and steel, and the Allies were trying to turn every advantage into momentum, yet within their own command, a quieter, far more dangerous battle unfolded. A battle of personalities that could undo months of painstaking planning. Patton's divisions moved with a ferocity that left both soldiers and commanders breathless. Tanks roared through the countryside, leaving shattered German positions in their wake, infantry following to consolidate gains. From the front lines, reports reached Eisenhower with increasing frequency, each describing astonishing feats of speed and daring. Men spoke of Patton's leadership as if he were a force of nature, a man who lived on the edge of chaos, capable of seeing the battlefield in ways no one else could. Yet with every report came unease. Patton's advances were brilliant, yes, but they were reckless. Supply lines were stretched thin, flanks left exposed, and communication with other Allied units, particularly Montgomery's, was increasingly fragmented. Montgomery, across the Channel and miles away from Patton's whirlwind approach, was the polar opposite of the American general. He pored over maps and reports, his office quiet except for the scratching of pencil on paper and the occasional soft murmur to his aides. Every movement was meticulously calculated, every attack coordinated with artillery, infantry, and air support. Montgomery's genius lay in preparation, in foreseeing not only the enemy's moves but the vulnerabilities of his own forces. Where Patton saw momentum, Montgomery saw risk. Where Patton saw opportunity, Montgomery saw catastrophe. The tension between the two men reached a boiling point as both advanced toward critical German positions in northern France. Patton's tanks had already broken through certain defenses, leaving the Germans scrambling, while Montgomery methodically secured each village and crossroads, ensuring that no Allied division would be cut off or overwhelmed. The press and Allied command alike celebrated Patton's speed, his apparent disregard for protocol, and his audacity. But for Eisenhower, the concern was growing. He understood Patton's brilliance, but he also understood the fragility of coalition warfare. One morning, Eisenhower received a flurry of messages that made him run his hand across his face in exhaustion. Montgomery accused Patton of endangering entire divisions with impulsive maneuvers. Patton fired back, claiming Montgomery's delays were costing precious time and, more importantly, men's lives. Each message was polite on the surface, adhering to military decorum, but the subtext screamed hostility. For the Supreme Commander, it was a nightmare scenario. Two of his most brilliant generals, both essential to victory, locked in a silent war that could fracture the Allies at the worst possible moment. Eisenhower decided a direct confrontation was necessary. He arranged a meeting at his headquarters, summoning both Patton and Montgomery to the same room, a move fraught with danger. As the generals arrived, the tension was palpable. Patton, brimming with energy and barely contained fury, strode into the room with his usual flair. Montgomery entered with his trademark calm, surveying the maps and reports with precise scrutiny, as if everything would be better if he simply looked harder. Eisenhower welcomed them both, trying to project calm authority, though inside he was acutely aware of the potential for disaster. The meeting began with discussion of troop movements, logistics, and timing. Yet it was impossible to separate the practical from the personal. Patton slammed his hand on the map, emphasizing the speed of his tanks and the urgency of pressing forward. "Every hour we wait is another hour the Germans regroup," he declared. "We can't afford hesitation. The opportunity is now, and if we delay, we will lose it forever." Montgomery responded with a quiet, measured tone that somehow carried an edge sharper than any raised voice. "George, speed without calculation is reckless. Casualties must be considered. We are liberating Europe, not merely advancing for the sake of pride. Coordination, not momentum, ensures that victories are sustainable. Otherwise, what you call progress becomes chaos." The clash of styles was immediate and unavoidable. Patton's fiery aggression contrasted sharply with Montgomery's calculated patience. Officers in the room exchanged nervous glances, aware that any spark could ignite a full-blown argument. Eisenhower, ever the mediator, intervened repeatedly, steering the conversation back to strategy and logistics, but the underlying tension remained. It was more than personality, it was philosophy. Patton believed in seizing opportunity, even at great risk. Montgomery believed in control, planning, and minimizing losses. Both were right, yet both believed the other dangerously wrong. Over the next few days, the rivalry spilled into every communication channel. Radio messages crackled with updates that often contradicted each other. Patton's advance threatened to overlap with Montgomery's planned positions, creating confusion and forcing Eisenhower to step in repeatedly to coordinate movements. Each intervention was a delicate balancing act, designed to prevent disaster without alienating either general. Patton's pride bristled at perceived interference, while Montgomery's meticulous calculations were threatened by unpredictable maneuvers. Officers on the ground experienced the consequences firsthand. Infantry units often found themselves caught between the whirlwind of Patton's tanks and the slow, deliberate pushes of Montgomery's formations. Orders were conflicting, timelines compressed, and every movement required careful interpretation. Soldiers learned to expect genius, but also chaos, and to trust that Eisenhower's oversight, as strained as it was, would prevent catastrophe. Patton, restless and impatient, often visited the front lines himself, a constant presence among the troops. His reputation inspired awe and fear alike. Soldiers described him as unstoppable, a man who seemed to anticipate the enemy's every move. Yet for every brilliant maneuver, there were moments of risk that could have ended in disaster. Supply lines were stretched, artillery support sometimes delayed, and communication channels overtaxed. In these moments, the war room in London and Eisenhower's headquarters were filled with anxious voices, calculating worst-case scenarios while marveling at Patton's audacity. Montgomery, meanwhile, remained in his headquarters, meticulously adjusting plans to account for every eventuality. He analyzed the terrain, studied enemy movements, and coordinated artillery, infantry, and air support to perfection. His genius was quiet, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but devastatingly effective. Where Patton relied on intuition, Montgomery relied on precision. Where Patton inspired audacity, Montgomery inspired confidence and discipline. Each approach had merit, but when they collided, the result was friction that threatened to unravel months of progress. Eisenhower grew increasingly aware that the battle was not only against the German army, it was against internal discord. The Allies were united on paper, but in practice, the delicate coalition was strained by personality, pride, and differing approaches to warfare. Every decision required careful consideration, every movement calculated not only against the enemy but also against the temperaments of the generals commanding the forces. Eisenhower's role became less about issuing orders and more about managing egos, mediating conflicts, and preventing disaster born not from the enemy, but from his own brilliant commanders. Despite the tension, progress continued. Patton's divisions captured towns at dizzying speed, leaving trails of liberated communities behind them. Civilians greeted the American tanks with relief and joy, their cheers echoing across the countryside. Yet Montgomery's methodical approach ensured that gains were consolidated, supply lines secured, and flanks protected. It was a brutal but effective combination: speed to shock the enemy, precision to hold the line. The problem was that the generals themselves were barely cooperating, their rivalry threatening to turn the battlefield into a minefield of miscommunication and misunderstanding. At night, Eisenhower often reviewed reports alone, tracing movements on maps with weary fingers, his mind juggling personalities, tactics, and the ever-present threat of German counterattacks. He knew that any misstep could be catastrophic. Patton's brilliance could falter. Without Montgomery's caution could stagnate without Patton's momentum. Victory required both, yet victory also required that they somehow subordinate their personal animosities to the greater cause. One evening, a message arrived that brought the tension to a head. Montgomery reported that one of Patton's units had advanced into a sector he had intended to secure, creating confusion and risking supply disruptions. Patton fired back immediately, accusing Montgomery of unnecessary delays that jeopardized the operation. The messages were polite, yet the underlying hostility was unmistakable. Eisenhower read them and felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. The war was not only against Hitler, it was against his own general's pride and ambition. The following day, Eisenhower convened another meeting. This time the atmosphere was even more charged. Patton, red-faced with barely contained anger, slammed his hands on the table, pointing at the map with exaggerated gestures. "I will not wait," he shouted. "I will not be slowed down by caution. We have momentum, and we must strike while the enemy falters." Montgomery, seated with perfect posture, adjusted his spectacles and replied in his calm, measured tone. "And yet, George, caution prevents disaster. Speed without calculation is meaningless. We must consider the larger picture. One misstep can undo everything we have worked for. Lives are at stake." The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the radio and the scratching of pencils on paper. Eisenhower inhaled slowly, weighing his words carefully. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice firm yet conciliatory, "I know your methods differ, I know your philosophies clash, but we are united by one purpose: victory. The enemy does not care about our disagreements. Every division, every soldier, every maneuver must work in concert. This rivalry, your rivalry, cannot dictate the outcome of the war." Patton's expression softened, only slightly, as he realized the truth of Eisenhower's words. Montgomery, ever composed, nodded once, acknowledging the delicate balance that now hung over them. They did not become friends. Their rivalry did not vanish, but, at least for the moment, it was contained. Over the following weeks, a strange rhythm emerged. Patton's audacity was tempered, just enough to prevent disaster. Montgomery's caution was applied with flexibility, just enough to allow momentum. Eisenhower acted as the linchpin, a steady hand guiding two forces that could so easily tear the coalition apart. It was a dangerous, delicate balance. One misstep, one insult, one rash decision, and the fragile alliance could fracture entirely. And yet, despite the tension, the Allies advanced. Towns were liberated, enemy positions dismantled, and the momentum of the campaign grew unstoppable. Patton's tanks roared through the countryside like thunder, leaving chaos in their wake. Montgomery's forces secured every gain with surgical precision, ensuring that the victories were lasting. Victory was within reach, but it was forged in the crucible of conflict, not just against the enemy, but within the ranks of the Allies themselves. The tension that had smoldered for months between Patton and Montgomery reached its ultimate test in the final weeks of the campaign across northern Europe. The Allied armies were pushing deeper into German territory, but every advance was shadowed by uncertainty, not merely from the enemy, but from the fragile cohesion among their own forces. Eisenhower's headquarters was a hive of activity, every officer, aide, and messenger acutely aware that the outcome of the war now rested as much on human temperament as on tactics, numbers, or firepower. Patton's armored divisions, moving with the speed and audacity for which they were famed, had already cut deep into German lines. Villages were liberated in days that had previously taken weeks, and the enemy was in retreat, scrambling to regroup. Reports poured in continuously, towns captured, bridges secured, enemy convoys destroyed. Patton's boldness had created a ripple effect of chaos in the German ranks, and the momentum seemed unstoppable. Yet each report carried the same cautionary undertone that Eisenhower had come to dread. Flanks were exposed, supply lines strained, and coordination with Montgomery's forces was increasingly tenuous. Montgomery, in contrast, remained methodical and deliberate. His forces advanced at a measured pace, securing each captured position, reinforcing supply lines, and coordinating artillery, infantry, and air support. Every move was calculated, leaving little room for error, and his meticulous planning minimized casualties. Where Patton relied on instinct, Montgomery relied on precision. Where Patton was fire, Montgomery was ice. And now, in the climactic weeks of the campaign, these two forces were moving toward the same objectives, their differing approaches threatening to collide with catastrophic consequences. Eisenhower spent long nights in his war room, tracing the paths of both generals across the maps, calculating outcomes, and preparing contingency plans. He had learned to anticipate Patton's audacity and Montgomery's caution, yet he knew that even his foresight had limits. The stakes could not have been higher. One misstep could cost thousands of lives, unravel the Allies' advances, and prolong a war that had already exacted unimaginable suffering. Every officer who entered the room sensed the strain, the tension palpable, the sense of history pressing down upon them. One morning, reports came in that Patton's advance had brought his divisions dangerously close to Montgomery's planned positions. Eisenhower's staff scrambled to coordinate communication between the two generals, knowing that any misalignment could lead to disaster. Patton, fueled by frustration and ambition, saw Montgomery's deliberate pace as a threat to the operation's momentum. Montgomery, equally determined, saw Patton's unrestrained advances as reckless and potentially fatal. Messages crossed the command lines like lightning bolts, polite on paper, explosive in intent. Eisenhower knew that a face-to-face meeting was inevitable. He summoned both generals to his headquarters, the tension in the room crackling like gunpowder. Patton entered first, the embodiment of controlled chaos, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes burning with intensity. Montgomery followed, calm, precise, and calculating, his every gesture deliberate, his gaze sharp and unflinching. Eisenhower welcomed them both, projecting authority, though inside he carried the heavy burden of what might come if their rivalry boiled over. The meeting began with maps, charts, and reports. Patton emphasized speed and momentum, slamming his hand on the table to illustrate points, his voice rising in intensity. Every hour we delay, the Germans regroup. Every hour men die. If we hesitate, the opportunity is gone. Montgomery, sitting with his posture perfect, replied in his cool, measured tone. And yet, George, haste without calculation risks everything. Lives are not expendable, and victory is meaningless if it is built on chaos. Coordination is not delay, it is preservation. Every division must advance with precision, or we risk disaster. The tension was electric. Officers shifted nervously in their seats, aware that any misstep could ignite a confrontation more dangerous than the enemy outside. Eisenhower intervened repeatedly, mediating, clarifying, and attempting to steer the discussion back toward strategy. Yet the underlying conflict could not be hidden. It was not merely a clash of strategy, it was a clash of philosophy, temperament, and ambition. For hours, the generals debated positions, movements, and tactics. Patton argued for immediate action, seizing villages, bridges, and crossroads before the enemy could reinforce. Montgomery countered with calculated advances, securing each objective, coordinating artillery barrages, and ensuring that no division would be isolated. The room became a microcosm of the battlefield itself, chaos against order, audacity against caution, speed against precision. As the meeting ended, Eisenhower knew that the real test would come on the battlefield. The next days were critical. Patton's tanks thundered forward, advancing through towns liberated in previous operations, their engines roaring like a warning to the enemy. Soldiers under his command marveled at his audacity and feared the consequences of any miscalculation. Supply officers grimaced at the stretched lines, while intelligence officers tried to predict the enemy's response to such rapid advances. Montgomery's forces moved in parallel, slower but unyielding, securing captured villages, fortifying positions, and preparing for the inevitable German counterattacks. Each step was calculated, leaving no room for error. Where Patton's audacity created shock, Montgomery's precision provided stability. And yet, neither man could fully appreciate the other's brilliance, nor could they fully suppress the simmering rivalry that threatened to undo the Allied effort. The breaking point came when both forces converged near a critical German supply hub. Patton's armored divisions were already in motion, moving at a pace that risked overextension. Montgomery's units approached from a different direction, meticulously coordinating artillery and infantry. Eisenhower's headquarters became a whirlwind of communication, with messages sent and received, orders clarified, and contingencies implemented. The entire operation hinged on coordination, timing, and the grudging cooperation of two men who openly despised each other. On the battlefield, necessity forced a temporary truce. Patton, recognizing Montgomery's fortified positions and strategic importance, adjusted his movements to align with the British general's plans. Montgomery, acknowledging the momentum Patton had created, allowed the American forces to exploit breakthroughs and push deeper into enemy territory. For the first time, ego was subordinated to strategy, and the results were extraordinary. The combined forces struck with unprecedented power. German units were overwhelmed, unable to react to the synchronized assault. Patton's tanks tore through defenses with lightning speed, while Montgomery's forces ensured that every gain was consolidated, flanks protected, and supply lines secured. The battlefield became a symphony of precision and audacity, a deadly dance that neither man could have orchestrated alone. Back at headquarters, Eisenhower watched reports come in with a mixture of relief and awe. The two generals, who had threatened to fracture the Allied coalition, had found a way, through necessity, not friendship, to combine their strengths. Thousands of lives were saved, entire divisions preserved, and the momentum of the campaign accelerated, to a pace few had thought possible. It was a triumph born not of compromise, but of pragmatism, discipline, and the recognition that even the fiercest rivalries could be harnessed for victory. In the aftermath of the operation, both generals returned to Eisenhower's headquarters, stiff, formal, and wary of each other. Patton, his eyes still burning with intensity, nodded once to Montgomery, a gesture of acknowledgement, not friendship. Montgomery returned the nod, equally formal, equally cautious. They had not reconciled, nor had they become allies in the truest sense, but in that moment, they had demonstrated that brilliance, even when divided by rivalry, could be a force greater than the sum of its parts. Eisenhower allowed himself a rare smile, though the tension in his shoulders remained. The world would never fully know how close the Allies had come to internal collapse, nor how the animosity between two of its greatest generals had nearly cost everything. The battlefield outside continued to roar with artillery, tanks, and the cries of men fighting for their lives. Yet inside the war room, a different kind of victory had been achieved, the triumph of pragmatism over pride, and unity forged not from affection, but from necessity. In the weeks that followed, the Allied advance continued, faster, more coordinated, and more effective than ever before. Patton's audacity and Montgomery's precision, once at odds, now operated in a tentative harmony that neither man fully trusted but both respected. Towns were liberated, supply lines secured, and German forces pushed back further than anticipated. The Allies were closer than ever to ultimate victory, and the lessons of rivalry, restraint, and the delicate balance of egos would echo in military history for decades to come. By the time the final German positions were breached, Eisenhower knew that the war had been won not just on the battlefield, but within the ranks of his own command. Patton and Montgomery remained as different as fire and ice, their rivalry undiminished, but their calm, bind brilliance had achieved what neither could have accomplished alone. History would remember the victories, the strategy, and the liberation of Europe. What it would never fully capture was the delicate, almost invisible force that had prevented internal collapse. The tension, the grudging cooperation, and the deadly dance of two men whose hatred had nearly broken the Allies, but ultimately helped save the world. And so, in the quiet moments after the last reports were filed, Eisenhower reflected on the improbable nature of it all. The Allies had survived not just because of tanks, bullets, or planning, but because, somehow, the brilliance of rivalry had been harnessed into victory. Patton would continue to rage, Montgomery to calculate, and the war would continue to honor their differences as much as their achievements. The world would see heroes on the battlefield. Eisenhower, who had borne the burden of command, understood that sometimes the greatest battles were fought not against the enemy, but within one's own ranks. In the end, victory was achieved. The Allies held Europe, millions of lives were spared, and the Axis powers were defeated. Yet the story of Patton and Montgomery remained, a tale of genius clashing with genius, of rivalry threatening ruin, and of a leader's skill in holding the fragile coalition together against impossible odds. The war had been won, not in spite of the hatred between two generals, but because, against all expectations, that hatred had been restrained long enough to achieve something far greater than either could achieve alone.